The morning mist clung to the mountains surrounding Fort Apache like a shroud. But through the scope of her Barrett M82, Staff Sergeant Catherine "Cat" Sullivan could see everything with crystalline clarity. The target, a rusted oil drum placed precisely 1,847 yards downrange, sat motionless in the crosshairs. No wind, perfect visibility. Her breathing slowed to match the rhythm of her heartbeat, and in the space between breaths, she squeezed the trigger. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The .50 caliber round left the barrel at 2,800 feet per second. And 3 seconds later, the drum exploded in a shower of metal fragments. Around her, a dozen junior snipers lowered their binoculars with expressions of awe that never got old. At 28, Catherine Sullivan held the longest confirmed kill shot in the history of the United States. Army 2,430 yards in Afghanistan, a record that had stood unchallenged for 3 years. That's how you account for atmospheric pressure. At elevation, she said, her voice carrying the easy confidence of someone who understood physics the way most people understood breathing. The air's thinner up here at 7,000 feet. Your bullet's going to travel faster and drop less than your calculations suggest. Trust your instincts, but verify with your data. Private First Class Jake Morrison, barely 19 and fresh from basic training, raised his hand tentatively. Sergeant Sullivan, how do you know when to take the shot? I mean, when everything's perfect like that. Catherine smiled, remembering when she'd asked the same question 8 years ago. Perfect doesn't exist in combat, Morrison. You learn to work with good enough, because good enough saves lives. Perfect gets people killed while you're waiting for conditions that never come. The Marksmanship Training Center at Fort Apache sat nestled in the high desert of Colorado, where the thin air and unforgiving terrain created some of the most challenging shooting conditions in the world. If you could hit your target here, you could hit it anywhere. The facility stretched across 3,000 acres of rugged landscape, with shooting lanes that extended beyond 2 miles and elevation changes that would humble even experienced. Marksman. Catherine had been running the Advanced Sniper program for 2 years, transforming raw recruits into precision instruments of warfare. Her methods were unconventional. She taught her students to read the landscape like a book, to feel the wind's intentions before it touched their faces, to understand that the perfect shot wasn't about the equipment or the conditions, but about the shooter's ability to adapt to imperfection. The program's success rate spoke for itself. 93% of her graduates earned their sniper designation on the first attempt, compared to the Army-wide average of 67%. More importantly, her students came back alive. In 4 years of deployment, not a single one of her graduates had been killed in action, a statistical anomaly that had earned her recognition at the highest levels of military command. But Catherine's reputation extended far beyond the training grounds. She was the daughter of a Colorado rancher who taught her to shoot prairie dogs at 400 yards when she was 12. By 16, she was winning competitive shooting matches across the western states. At 18, she'd enlisted in the Army with a marksmanship score that broke the previous record by 17 points. Her first deployment to Afghanistan had been a revelation. While other soldiers struggled with the heat, the dust, and the constant threat of enemy fire, Catherine thrived in the chaos. She possessed an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under pressure, to slow time down when everything around her was moving too fast. Her fellow soldiers called it the zone, that mental state where external distractions faded away, and only the shot mattered. The mountains of Afghanistan had been her proving ground. During her second tour, she'd been attached to a reconnaissance unit tasked with eliminating high-value targets in the Hindu Kush. The terrain was unforgiving vertical rock faces, unpredictable weather, and enemy positions that seemed impossible to reach. But Catherine had learned to use the environment as an ally rather than an obstacle. On a January morning in 2019, her unit had been tasked with providing overwatch for a convoy moving through the Korangal Valley. Intelligence suggested the route was clear, but Catherine's instincts told her otherwise. She'd positioned herself on a ridgeline overlooking the valley floor, her rifle trained on a cluster of buildings that offered perfect concealment for an ambush. When the attack came, it happened exactly as she'd predicted. Insurgents opened fire from multiple positions, turning the narrow valley into a killing field. The convoy was pinned down, unable to advance or retreat. That's when Catherine had spotted the enemy commander, a man in traditional Afghan dress, directing the assault from a rooftop nearly 2.5 miles away. The shot that made her famous had been attempted in conditions that would have challenged even the most experienced marksman. Crosswinds gusting up to 15 miles per hour, extreme elevation changes, and a target that was barely visible to the naked eye. She'd had to account for the Coriolis effect, the rotation of the Earth itself, and calculate bullet drop across a distance that pushed her weapon system to its absolute limits. The mathematics alone were staggering. At 2,430 yards, her bullet would take nearly 4 seconds to reach the target, dropping more than 60 feet during its flight. The crosswind would push the round laterally by almost 8 feet if she didn't compensate correctly. And all of this had to be calculated in seconds, while enemy fire erupted around her position. But Catherine had made the shot. The enemy commander fell, and the coordinated assault collapsed within minutes. The convoy escaped with minimal casualties, and Catherine Sullivan became a legend. The story had spread through military channels like wildfire. Soldiers who'd never met her knew her name. Officers who'd spent decades in service spoke of her with reverence. She'd been featured in military publications, interviewed by defense contractors, and recruited by special operations units that operated in shadows so deep they had no official designation. Fort Apache had been her reward, a chance to share her knowledge with the next generation of marksmen. The posting was considered a plum assignment, a way for the Army to showcase its investment in advanced training, while giving one of its most valuable assets a chance to multiply her impact. The base itself was a testament to military precision. Established in 1943 as a training facility for mountain warfare, it had evolved into one of the most sophisticated shooting ranges in the world. The main complex housed classrooms equipped with ballistic computers, wind tunnels for testing ammunition performance, and simulators that could replicate shooting conditions from any environment on Earth. But the real magic happened on the ranges themselves. The facility boasted 12 separate shooting lanes, each designed to test different aspects of marksmanship. The 1,000-yard range was for basic precision work. The mile-long range challenged shooters to account for atmospheric conditions and bullet drop. And the legendary long-shot range, where Catherine had just demonstrated her skills, extended nearly 2 miles into the high desert, offering shots that pushed both equipment and shooter to their absolute limits. The instructors at Fort Apache represented the cream of military marksmanship. Master Sergeant Robert Chun had been a Marine sniper in Iraq, with 47 confirmed kills and a Purple Heart from a roadside bomb that had nearly ended his career. Sergeant First Class Maria Gonzalez had earned her reputation in special operations, conducting missions in South America that officially never happened. Staff Sergeant David Parker had been a Navy SEAL before transferring to the Army, bringing with him techniques for underwater shooting that seemed to defy physics. But even among this elite group, Catherine stood apart. Her students didn't just learn to shoot, they learned to think like hunters, to read their environment like a predator stalking prey. She taught them that marksmanship was only 20% technical skill. The other 80% was mental, the ability to remain calm when everything was chaos, to trust your training when your instincts screamed danger, to make the perfect shot when lives depended on it. The morning training session concluded with Catherine's traditional debrief. Her students gathered around her in a semicircle, their faces still flushed with excitement from watching her demonstration. These were soldiers who'd already proven themselves in basic training. Men and women selected for advanced marksmanship based on their exceptional scores and psychological profiles. But in Catherine's presence, they looked like children discovering magic for the first time. "Tomorrow we'll be working on moving targets," she announced, her voice carrying across the range. "The enemy doesn't stand still and pose for you. They run, they dodge, they try to make themselves difficult to hit. Your job is to predict where they're going to be, not where they are." Private Morrison raised his hand again. "Sergeant, what's the hardest shot you've ever made?" Catherine paused, considering the question. Her record-setting shot in Afghanistan was the longest, but not necessarily the hardest. She thought about a rainy night in Syria, tracking a terrorist leader through the narrow streets of Aleppo. The shot had been only 300 yards, but the conditions, wind, rain, civilian interference had made it nearly impossible. She'd had to wait for 6 hours, motionless on a rooftop, before the perfect moment presented itself. "The hardest shot," she said finally, "is always the next one, because that's the one that matters." As the students dispersed, heading back to the barracks for lunch, Catherine remained on the range. This was her sanctuary, the place where everything made sense. In a world of military bureaucracy and political maneuvering, the range offered pure truth. Either you hit your target or you didn't. Either you had the skill or you didn't. Either you could perform under pressure or you couldn't. She walked to the spotting scope and examined the destroyed oil drum through its powerful lens. The .50 caliber round had punched through the metal like it was paper, creating a hole you could put your fist through. The precision still thrilled her, the ability to place a projectile exactly where she intended it to go, regardless of distance or conditions. But as she cleaned her rifle with the methodical precision that had become second nature, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The mountains of Colorado were beautiful, the work was satisfying, and her students were eager to learn. But she was a warrior trapped in a teacher's role, a predator forced to hunt paper targets instead of real prey. The Army had given her everything she'd ever wanted: respect, recognition, and the chance to do what she did best. But lately, she'd begun to wonder if there was something more, some greater purpose that she hadn't yet discovered, some challenge that would test not just her marksmanship, but her character. As she locked her rifle in the armory and headed toward the base cafeteria, Catherine Sullivan had no idea that her greatest challenge was still ahead of her. That within a matter of months, everything she'd built would be stripped away by lies and political manipulation. That she would lose not just her position and her reputation, but her very identity as a soldier. And that when the moment came to prove who she really was, it would happen not on a training range with perfect conditions, but in the chaos of real combat, with a shot that would be remembered long after her name was forgotten. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The legend of Catherine Sullivan was about to begin. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, hand-delivered by a courier who refused to make eye contact. Catherine recognized the official seal of the Inspector General's office before she even opened it. Inside, a single sheet of paper requested her presence at a formal inquiry scheduled for the following Thursday. The subject line read, "Alleged misconduct during Operation Desert Wind, Syria, March 2020. Catherine stared at the document for a full minute, her coffee growing cold in her hands. Operation Desert Wind had been classified at the highest levels. Only 12 people knew the complete details of what had happened during those 72 hours in the Syrian desert. The fact that someone was now questioning her conduct meant that one of those 12 had decided she was expendable. The operation had been a joint task force mission. Army Rangers, Navy SEALs, and Air Force Special Operations working together to extract a high-value intelligence asset from Damascus. Catherine had been attached to the team as their designated marksman, tasked with providing overwatch during the extraction. What should have been a routine rescue had turned into a nightmare when their intelligence proved catastrophically wrong. Instead of finding a single asset waiting for extraction, they'd walked into a trap. Syrian military forces had been waiting for them, along with Russian advisors who knew exactly how American special operations teams operated. The 12-man team had been pinned down in an abandoned factory complex, surrounded by enemy forces that outnumbered them 20-1. That's when Major Thomas Blackwood had made the decision that would haunt Catherine for the rest of her career. Instead of calling for extraction and accepting the loss of the intelligence asset, he'd ordered the team to push deeper into enemy territory. His reasoning was sound from a strategic perspective. The asset possessed information about Russian weapons shipments that could save American lives across the region. But tactically, the mission had become a suicide run. Catherine had been positioned on the factory's roof, providing cover fire while the team moved through the maze of industrial buildings below. Through her scope, she could see everything enemy positions, friendly movements, and the growing impossibility of their situation. That's when she'd spotted the Russian sniper team setting up on an adjacent rooftop, their rifles trained on the building where Major Blackwood was coordinating the rescue. The shot had been clean 875 yards through a narrow window, eliminating both enemy snipers before they could engage. But in making that shot, Catherine had violated her rules of engagement. She'd been ordered to remain in position and provide covering fire only. Engaging targets beyond her designated sector required explicit authorization from command, authorization she hadn't waited to receive. The mission had ultimately succeeded. The intelligence asset was extracted, and the information he provided prevented a major terrorist attack on a U.S. embassy in Jordan. But success came at a cost. 3 American soldiers were killed during the firefight, and 2 more were critically wounded. Someone needed to be held accountable for those losses, and Catherine's violation of engagement protocols made her the perfect scapegoat. The inquiry had been conducted in a sterile conference room at the Pentagon, presided over by 3 officers Catherine had never met. Colonel Richard Hartley led the proceedings with the mechanical precision of someone who'd done this many times before. His questions were sharp, designed to expose inconsistencies and force admissions of guilt. Staff Sergeant Sullivan, he'd begun, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. You fired on enemy positions outside your designated sector without authorization from your commanding officer. Is this correct? Catherine had answered honestly. Yes, sir. I observed enemy snipers preparing to engage friendly forces. I made the tactical decision to eliminate the threat. A tactical decision that directly violated your rules of engagement and the explicit orders of your commanding officer. Sir, the enemy snipers had a clear line of sight to Major Blackwood's position. If I hadn't acted, he would have been killed. Colonel Hartley had smiled then, the cold expression of a predator sensing weakness. Staff Sergeant, are you suggesting that your judgment supersedes the judgment of your commanding officer? That your personal interpretation of the tactical situation should override explicit orders? The trap had been perfectly laid. If Catherine admitted that she'd acted without authorization, she was guilty of insubordination. If she defended her actions, she was guilty of questioning the chain of command. Either way, her career was over. But the real betrayal came when Major Blackwood took the stand. Catherine had expected him to defend her actions, to explain the tactical situation that had made her shot necessary. Instead, he'd thrown her completely under the bus. Staff Sergeant Sullivan has always been difficult to control, he'd testified, his words carefully measured. She has a tendency to act independently, to trust her own judgment over the judgment of her superiors. During Operation Desert Wind, this tendency manifested in a clear violation of orders that endangered the entire team. Catherine had felt Something died inside her chest as she listened to his testimony. This was the same man who'd personally recommended her for a Bronze Star after the mission. The same officer who'd told her that her actions had saved his life and the lives of half the team. Now he was describing her as a rogue operator who couldn't follow orders. The psychological evaluation had been the killing blow. Dr. Elizabeth Warner, a military psychologist who'd interviewed Catherine for exactly 45 minutes, had compiled a report that painted her as emotionally unstable and unsuitable for combat operations. The document described her as overly aggressive, unable to accept authority, and potentially dangerous to unit cohesion. Catherine had read the evaluation in stunned silence. Every strength that had made her an exceptional soldier, her independence, her ability to make split-second decisions, her willingness to take calculated risks, had been reframed as psychological defects. Her legendary calm under fire was described as emotional detachment. Her tactical brilliance was labeled as inability to follow established protocols. The hearing had lasted 3 days, but the outcome had been predetermined from the moment she'd walked into the room. Catherine Sullivan was stripped of her instructor position, demoted to sergeant, and reassigned to administrative duties pending further evaluation. Her security clearance was revoked, her access to classified materials terminated, and her reputation within the special operations community systematically destroyed. But the worst part wasn't the loss of rank or position. It was the silence that followed. Officers who'd once sought her advice suddenly couldn't remember her name. Soldiers who'd trained under her acted as if she didn't exist. The entire military community that had once celebrated her achievements now treated her like a cautionary tale. The reassignment to Fort Apache had been presented as a lateral move, a chance to continue serving while the investigation was ongoing. But Catherine knew the truth. She was being buried, filed away in a remote location where her presence wouldn't embarrass anyone important. Her new job title was Base Operations Coordinator, which sounded official until you realized it meant she was responsible for managing the coffee service in the officers' mess. The irony wasn't lost on her. The woman who'd once been considered one of the most lethal soldiers in the Army was now measuring coffee grounds and restocking sugar dispensers. She traded her Barrett M82 for a commercial coffee machine, her tactical gear for a food service uniform, her sniper's ghillie suit for an apron that read Fort Apache Catering Services. The other instructors at Fort Apache treated her with a mixture of pity and embarrassment. They knew who she was, what she'd accomplished, but they also knew that associating with her could damage their own careers. So they took their coffee with polite thank yous and avoided eye contact, pretending not to notice the woman who'd once been their equal, serving them like a civilian contractor. Major Jennifer Walsh, the new head of the marksmanship program, had made it clear from day one that Catherine's presence was unwelcome. Walsh was a competent instructor with solid credentials, but she lacked the intuitive understanding of long-range shooting that separated good marksmen from great ones. Her methods were textbook perfect and completely uninspiring. The coffee station needs to be restocked by 0700 every morning, Walsh had explained during Catherine's first day in her new role. Officers' mess opens at 0630 and they expect fresh coffee immediately. Any delays reflect poorly on the entire base. Catherine had nodded silently, biting back the dozen responses that came to mind. This was her life now, measuring coffee, monitoring supply levels, ensuring that the officers who'd once respected her had adequate caffeine to fuel their important work. The woman who'd killed enemy combatants at ranges, approaching a mile and a half, was now worried about whether the hazelnut creamer was adequately stocked. The worst part was the whispers. Soldiers would stop talking when she entered a room, then resumed their conversations in hushed tones after she'd passed. She caught fragments of discussions about her fall from grace, speculation about what had really happened in Syria, theories about why someone with her reputation had ended up serving. Coffee, Some of the rumors were surprisingly close to the truth. Others painted her as everything from a war criminal to a foreign agent. But all of them shared the same underlying message. Catherine Sullivan had fallen from grace because she couldn't follow orders, couldn't work within the system, couldn't be trusted with the responsibilities that had once defined her life. The isolation was complete and devastating. Her former students stopped visiting the base. Her colleagues in the special operations community acted as if she'd never existed. Even her family, proud ranchers who'd bragged about their daughter's military service, had grown quiet about her career. The official story was that she'd requested a transfer to administrative duties. The truth was too embarrassing to share, but Major Blackwood hadn't been content with simply destroying her career. Over the months that followed the inquiry, Catherine began to notice a pattern in the assignments given to soldiers who'd served under her command. Promising careers were derailed by sudden transfers to undesirable locations. Promotion recommendations were mysteriously delayed or denied. Blackwood was systematically eliminating anyone who might corroborate Catherine's version of events in Syria. The message was clear. Challenging Major Thomas Blackwood's narrative would result in career suicide. And since Blackwood had been promoted to lieutenant colonel and given command of a special operations unit, he now had the power to make good on that threat. Catherine had considered fighting back, demanding a formal review of the inquiry, filing complaints through official channels. But every avenue for appeal led back to the same network of officers who'd already decided her fate. The system that had once rewarded her excellence now protected those who'd chosen to sacrifice her for their own advancement. So she'd adapted, the way soldiers always do. She learned to be invisible, to move through the base like a ghost of her former self. She arrived early, stayed late, and performed her duties with the same precision she'd once applied to long-range shooting. If the Army wanted her to serve coffee, she'd serve the best damn coffee in military history. But late at night, alone in her small apartment off base, Catherine would clean her personal rifle with the methodical care of someone who hadn't forgotten who she really was. The weapon was a civilian version of her military sniper rifle, legally purchased and properly registered. She'd take it to public ranges on weekends, maintaining her skills even though she wasn't allowed to use them professionally. The rifle remembered what the Army had chosen to forget. In Catherine's hands, it was still capable of impossible shots, still capable of reaching out across vast distances to touch targets that others couldn't even see. The gun didn't care about politics or promotion potential or the opinions of officers who'd never looked through a scope in combat. As autumn turned to winter at Fort Apache, Catherine Sullivan settled into her new reality. She was the coffee lady now, invisible and forgotten. A cautionary tale about what happened to soldiers who couldn't stay in their lane. But deep down, in the part of her soul that had never missed a shot when it mattered, she remained what she'd always been, a warrior waiting for someone to need saving. She had no idea that her moment was coming sooner than anyone expected. Alarm clock read 4:47 a.m. when Catherine's eyes opened in the darkness of her studio apartment. No dreams had woken her sleep, had become a luxury she couldn't afford since the nightmares started. 3 years of serving coffee to officers who pretended not to recognize her had taught her that the early morning hours were the only time that truly belonged to her. She dressed in the same routine that had sustained her through 2 combat deployments. Boots first, laced with military precision, then the civilian clothes that had replaced her beloved ACUs. The closet held exactly 7 identical outfits: khaki pants, plain white shirts, and a cardigan that hid the scars on her left arm from shrapnel in Afghanistan. Simplicity was armor against a world that had decided she no longer mattered. Drive to Fort Apache took 23 minutes through the Colorado mountain roads, past ranches that reminded her of the childhood she'd left behind when she enlisted. Her father had stopped asking when she was coming home for visits. Her mother had stopped bragging about her daughter's military service at church socials. The family that had once celebrated her achievements now spoke of her in careful, neutral terms that revealed nothing and protected everyone. The base commissary opened at 5:30 a.m., and Catherine was always the first customer. She'd learned to shop early before the other personnel arrived, avoiding the uncomfortable encounters that had become routine. Last week, she'd run into Sergeant Martinez, one of her former students, who'd looked through her like she was furniture. The same man who'd credited her with saving his life during a training accident now couldn't make eye contact while buying cereal. But the commissary held one unexpected gift. In the corner, barely visible unless you knew where to look, stood a small memorial display honoring fallen soldiers from Fort Apache. Among the photographs and personal effects, Catherine had discovered a letter from Private James, Morrison Jake's older brother, who'd been killed in action in Iraq 2 years before Jake arrived at the base. The letter mentioned her by name, describing how her training had kept him alive for 7 months in Fallujah before an IED finally got him. She'd read that letter dozens of times, memorizing every word. It was proof that her work had mattered, that somewhere in the bureaucratic nightmare that had destroyed her career, she'd actually saved lives. The letter had become her anchor, reminding her that regardless of what the Army said about her now, she'd once been exactly the soldier she'd set out to be. The coffee service began at 6 a.m. sharp. Catherine arrived at the officers' mess with the same precision she'd once applied to calculating windage and elevation. Industrial coffee makers don't require the same finesse as a Barrett M82, but she'd learned to approach both with identical focus. If the Army wanted her to serve coffee, she'd serve it better than anyone in the history of military food service. The irony wasn't lost on her. The woman who'd once been trusted with million-dollar weapon systems now struggled to afford rent. On a part-time salary, her coffee service position was classified as temporary civilian contractor rather than military personnel, which meant no benefits, no job security, and a paycheck that barely covered basic expenses. The Army had found the perfect way to humiliate her, keeping her on base where everyone could see her fall from grace, but stripping away the military status that had once defined her identity. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes, the base commander, had made it clear during Catherine's first week that her presence was an embarrassment to be managed, rather than an asset to be utilized. Hayes was a career administrator who'd never seen combat, but she understood institutional politics with the instincts of a born survivor. She'd inherited Catherine as part of the base's staffing, and she treated her like a problem to be contained. "Your job is to provide coffee service and nothing more," Hayes had explained during their only face-to-face meeting. "You're not to offer tactical advice, discuss your previous assignments, or engage in any activities that might remind people of your former position. The Army has made its decision about your career, and we're all expected to respect that decision." The message was crystal clear. Catherine Sullivan was to be a living ghost, present but invisible, functional but forgotten. She was a cautionary tale made flesh, a reminder to other soldiers about what happened when you stepped outside the lines that kept careers safe and reputations intact. The daily routine had become a meditation on insignificance. Arrive at 5:45 a.m., unlock the officers' mess, start the coffee makers, arrange the pastries delivered by the base bakery, and wait for the first customers to arrive. By 6:15 a.m., the room would fill with the low murmur of morning briefings and casual conversations about training schedules, personnel decisions, and the 1,000 administrative details that kept the military base functioning. Catherine had learned to listen without appearing to listen, to process information without reacting to it. The officers spoke freely around her, as if she were a piece of furniture that happened to pour coffee. She'd heard discussions about classified training missions, budget allocations for special operations, and personnel decisions that affected soldiers she'd once trained. The information was professionally irrelevant to her new role, but she couldn't help analyzing it with the tactical mind that had made her legendary. The hardest part wasn't the work itself, it was watching other people do the job she'd once excelled at. Major Walsh had transformed the marksmanship program into a by-the-book operation that produced competent shooters but no legends. The advanced techniques Catherine had developed were abandoned in favor of standard military doctrine. The intuitive understanding of long-range shooting that had made her students exceptional was replaced by rigid adherence to official procedures. Catherine watched Walsh's students struggle with shots that her former pupils would have made instinctively. She saw them fail training exercises that tested the very skills she'd been developing when her career was destroyed. But she remained silent, pouring coffee and pretending not to notice when promising marksmen were discharged for failing to meet standards they could have easily achieved under proper instruction. The financial pressure was relentless. Her contractor salary was less than half what she'd earned as a staff sergeant, and the Army had refused to provide transitional benefits after her demotion. She'd been forced to sell her personal firearms collection rifles worth thousands of dollars that represented years of careful selection and modification. The money had kept her afloat for 6 months, but it was gone now, along with the weapons that had connected her to the person she used to be. Her apartment was a testament to enforced minimalism. Government-issued furniture, bare walls, and a single photograph of her family taken the day she'd graduated from basic training. She'd kept only one rifle, a civilian bolt-action that she'd purchased with her last paycheck before the financial situation became desperate. It wasn't much, but it was hers, and it reminded her that some skills never fade regardless of how the world treats you. The weekends were the worst. Without the structure of work, without the distraction of routine, Catherine was left alone with the weight of everything she'd lost. She'd started volunteering at a local youth center, teaching basic marksmanship to teenagers who were considering military service. The kids didn't know about her history, didn't understand that the quiet woman teaching them to shoot had once been one of the most feared snipers in the Army, but they sensed something in her teaching, a depth of knowledge that went beyond textbook explanations. When 16-year-old Marcus Johnson asked her how she knew so much about shooting, Catherine had smiled and said, "I used to be pretty good at it." The understatement had become her standard response to questions about her background. Let them think she was a weekend warrior or a hunting enthusiast. The truth was too complicated to explain. That the youth center work was unpaid, but it fed something in Catherine's soul that had been starving since her demotion. These kids were hungry to learn, eager to improve, grateful for guidance that came without judgment or political agenda. They reminded her why she'd become a teacher in the first place, not for the recognition or the career advancement, but for the simple satisfaction of helping others discover their potential. Marcus had shown particular promise. The kid had natural instincts and the kind of focus that couldn't be taught. Under Catherine's guidance, he'd progressed from missing targets at 50 yards to consistent hits at 300 yards. His technique was still rough, his equipment basic, but he possessed the fundamental qualities that separated good shooters from great ones. "Miss Catherine," he'd asked during their last session, "do you think I'm good enough to be a sniper in the Army?" Catherine had looked at this earnest teenager, seeing echoes of her own younger self in his determined expression. "Marcus, being a sniper isn't about being good enough. It's about being willing to take responsibility for every shot you take. The Army will teach you the techniques, but they can't teach you the heart. That's something you have to decide for yourself." The conversation had haunted her for weeks. Here was a kid with genuine potential, asking the same question she'd asked as a teenager on her father's ranch. But the Army that had once nurtured her talents had become an institution that destroyed anyone who didn't fit perfectly into predefined molds. What advice could she give him? Follow your dreams and hope the system doesn't betray you the way it betrayed her. The isolation at Fort Apache was complete, but not absolute. Catherine had developed a handful of relationships with civilian contractors. and lower-ranking enlisted personnel who either didn't know her history or didn't care about it. Maria Santos, who managed the base laundry, had become something approaching a friend. They'd share lunch occasionally, two women who'd been overlooked by the military hierarchy for different reasons, but who understood the value of honest work. "You're too good for this place," Maria had told her one afternoon, gesturing at the coffee service setup. "I don't know what happened to you before, but I can tell you're not meant to be serving coffee to officers who can't even say thank you." Catherine had appreciated the sentiment, even if she couldn't explain why Maria was right. The truth was too complicated, too painful, and too dangerous to share. Better to let people think she was overqualified for her job than to risk the gossip and speculation that would follow if they knew the real story. The nights were filled with maintenance rituals that kept her connected to the soldier she'd once been. She'd clean her remaining rifle with the same attention to detail she'd once applied to her military weapons. She'd practice dry-firing exercises in her apartment, maintaining muscle memory and trigger control, even though she rarely had opportunities to actually shoot. She'd read military publications and tactical manuals, staying current with developments in sniper doctrine and equipment, even though the information was professionally useless to her. But the most important ritual was the letter writing. Every week, Catherine would compose a letter to her former students, the marksmen she'd trained who were now deployed around the world. She never sent the letters, she had no way to contact them, and reaching out would only remind them of their association with a disgraced instructor. Instead, she'd write about advanced techniques they might find useful, tactical considerations for different environments, and the mental disciplines that separated survivors from casualties. The letters were a way of continuing to teach, of maintaining the connection to her purpose, even when that purpose had been officially revoked. She'd file them in a folder that contained dozens of unsent communications, a curriculum for advanced marksmanship that would never be taught, knowledge that would die with her unless the world somehow remembered who she'd once been. 3 years had passed since her demotion, and Catherine had begun to accept that this was her life now. The coffee lady at Fort Apache, invisible and forgotten, a cautionary tale about what happened to soldiers who couldn't stay in their lane. She'd learned to find satisfaction in small victories, a perfect pot of coffee, a grateful nod from a junior officer, the progress of teenagers at the youth center who had no idea they were being trained by a legend. But late at night, when the mountain wind howled through the peaks surrounding the base, Catherine would stand at her apartment window and remember what it felt like to be essential. She'd remember the weight of her rifle, the satisfaction of impossible shots, the trust of soldiers who depended on her skills to bring them home safely. Those memories were all she had left of the person she'd once been, and she guarded them like precious secrets in a world that had decided she no longer deserved to exist. The woman who'd once been considered one of the most lethal soldiers in the Army now lived paycheck to paycheck, serving coffee to officers who'd forgotten her name. But in her hands, muscle memory intact and instincts sharp, she remained what she'd always been, a warrior waiting for someone to need saving. She just didn't know that her moment was less than 6 months away. The emergency klaxon shattered the morning stillness at Fort Apache like a sledgehammer through glass. Catherine's hands stilled on the coffee machine she'd been cleaning, her body responding to the alarm with muscle memory that 3 years of civilian service hadn't erased. The base-wide alert system hadn't been activated since she'd arrived. Training exercises used different signals, and real emergencies were rare in the Colorado mountains. Out through the windows of the officers' mess, she could see personnel running toward the command center, their movements sharp with the urgency that separated drill from reality. Whatever was happening, it wasn't practice. Catherine continued her work, knowing that her role in any emergency would be to stay out of the way and keep the coffee fresh for the officers who would need it during the long hours ahead. The first indication of the crisis's scope came when Lieutenant Colonel Hayes burst through the doors of the officers' mess, her usually perfect uniform disheveled and her face pale with stress. Behind her followed a stream of senior officers, their conversations urgent and fragmented. Catherine caught pieces of information as she moved invisibly through the room, refilling cups and pretending not to listen. The picture that emerged was grimmer than anything Catherine had expected. A diplomatic convoy en route to a peace negotiation in Afghanistan had been ambushed by Taliban forces in one of the most treacherous mountain passes in the world. Convoy consisted of 2 armored vehicles carrying State Department officials and a medical vehicle with Army medics. They were pinned down in a narrow valley, with enemy fighters controlling the surrounding RIDG, ELINE. Major Walsh stood at the center of the tactical discussion, her voice carrying the strain of someone who'd never commanded a real combat operation. The marksmanship program at Fort Apache was designed for training, not active missions, but they had the most advanced long-range shooting equipment in the region. The question was whether any of her current instructors had the skills to make a difference from extreme range. "The convoy is 12 miles southeast of our position," Walsh explained to the assembled officers. "Satellite imagery shows enemy positions on 3 ridge lines, approximately 800 to 1,500 yards from the valley floor. Our best marksmen have a theoretical maximum effective range of 800 yards under ideal conditions." Catherine paused while refilling the coffee urn, her tactical mind automatically processing the information. 12 miles wasn't an impossible distance for helicopter insertion, but the mountainous terrain and enemy air defenses would make it extremely dangerous. A ground approach would take hours through hostile territory. But there was another option, one that no one in the room was considering because they'd forgotten who was serving their coffee. General Robert Morrison, visiting Fort Apache for a routine inspection, studied the satellite imagery with the expression of a man watching disaster unfold in real time. Morrison was Jake's uncle, though Catherine doubted he remembered her from the training program she'd run years earlier. His reputation was built on creative solutions to impossible problems, but even he seemed stymied by the tactical situation. "What about air support?" Morrison asked, his voice cutting through the nervous chatter. "Nearest combat aircraft are at Bagram," Walsh replied. 43 minutes flight time under optimal conditions. Weather reports show increasing cloud cover that could delay or prevent airstrikes. Ground support? Rapid response team is mobilizing, but they're looking at a minimum 3-hour approach through hostile territory. The convoy doesn't have 3 hours. Catherine knew they were right. She'd studied the Karakoram Pass during her intelligence briefings for Afghanistan deployments. The terrain was a nightmare of vertical rock faces and narrow defiles that channeled movement into predictable kill zones. Whoever had planned this ambush had chosen their position perfectly. They could hold off a much larger force indefinitely from those ridgelines. But as she listened to the increasingly desperate tactical discussion, Catherine realized that everyone in the room was thinking conventionally. They were trying to solve the problem by getting closer to the enemy, by bringing superior firepower to bear through traditional means. No one was considering the possibility of engaging from their current position because no one believed it was possible. The mathematics were daunting, but not impossible. 12 miles equaled approximately 21,120 yards, well beyond the theoretical maximum range of any sniper rifle in the world. But Catherine had spent years pushing equipment beyond its theoretical limits, finding ways to make impossible shots. Through careful analysis of environmental factors and ballistic trajectories, the altitude difference between Fort Apache and the ambush site would add significantly to projectile velocity and range. The thin mountain air would reduce drag coefficients, and if she could find a position with direct line of sight... "Ma'am," Catherine said quietly, addressing Lieutenant Colonel Hayes. The room fell silent as every officer turned to stare at the woman who'd spoken out of turn. Hayes's expression was a mixture of embarrassment and anger. The coffee lady had just interrupted a classified tactical briefing. "I'm sorry," Hayes said icily, "but civilian contractors are not authorized to participate in operational discussions." Catherine felt the familiar weight of institutional dismissal, but something had changed in the 3 years since her demotion. She'd learned to care more about saving lives than saving face. "Ma'am, I believe there's a tactical option that hasn't been considered." The silence that followed was electric with tension. General Morrison studied Catherine with the sharp attention of someone who'd spent decades evaluating personnel under pressure. There was something in her bearing, something in the way she carried herself, that suggested military experience despite her civilian clothes. "You have something to contribute?" Morrison asked, his tone neutral but not dismissive. Catherine nodded toward the satellite imagery displayed on the wall monitor. "The topographical data shows a clear line of sight from Eagle Point to the ambush location. With proper equipment and environmental calculations, it's possible to provide precision fire support from our current position." Major Walsh laughed, the sound harsh with stress and disbelief. "Eagle Point is 12 miles from the target area. No rifle system in the world has that kind of effective range. The Barrett M82A1 has a maximum range of approximately 4,000 yards under ideal conditions." Catherine replied, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who'd tested those limits personally. "But at this altitude, with the ballistic advantage of firing downward into a valley, and accounting for reduced air resistance, the effective range increases significantly." "You're talking about a shot that's never been attempted," Walsh protested. "The longest confirmed sniper kill in history is less than half that distance." Catherine met her eyes steadily. "Yes, ma'am. It is." The implications of that simple statement settled over the room like a physical weight. Everyone present understood that they were listening to someone who believed she could make an impossible shot. Someone who spoke with the authority of experience rather than theory. General Morrison stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. "What's your background, miss?" "Sullivan, sir. I served 8 years in the Army before transitioning to civilian contractor status." It wasn't technically a lie, but it wasn't the complete truth either. Catherine could see recognition flickering in Morrison's eyes. He was remembering something. Some fragment of information about a Sullivan who'd been connected to legendary marksmanship. "Sullivan," he repeated slowly. "Were you involved in marksmanship?" "Training? Yes, sir, I was." Lieutenant Colonel Hayes intervened before the conversation could go further. "General Morrison, I don't think it's appropriate to involve civilian personnel in classified operations. Miss Sullivan's background, whatever it may be, doesn't authorize her participation in tactical decisions." But Morrison was studying Catherine with increasing interest. The pieces were falling into place, the bearing, the knowledge, the quiet confidence that came from someone who'd done things others only read about in classified reports. "Miss Sullivan," he said carefully, "are you suggesting that you personally could make this shot?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Catherine knew that her answer would change everything, that stepping forward would expose her to the same institutional forces that had destroyed her career once before. But 12 miles away, people were dying while officers debated theoretical possibilities. "Sir, I believe the shot is technically feasible," she said. "The environmental conditions are favorable, the equipment is available, and the tactical necessity is clear." "That's not what I asked." Catherine straightened, and for the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to stand at full military attention. "Yes, sir, I can make the shot." The transformation was immediate and unmistakable. The woman who'd been invisible for 3 years suddenly commanded the attention of every officer in the room. Her posture, her tone, her absolute certainty, everything about her projected the kind of confidence that came from successful completion of impossible missions. "General Morrison," Hayes protested, "this is highly irregular. We have qualified instructors who—" "How long do you need?" Morrison asked Catherine, cutting off Hayes's objection. Catherine was already calculating equipment requirements, environmental factors, and logistical necessities. 20 minutes to reach Eagle Point and establish a firing position. The shot itself depends on target identification and environmental conditions at the time of engagement. You understand that if you miss, those people are dead? Yes, sir. And if you're discovered making this attempt, there will be significant political and military consequences. Yes, sir. Morrison studied her for a long moment, weighing unknown factors in an equation that balanced lives against regulations, necessity against protocol. Finally, he nodded. Major Walsh, provide Miss Sullivan with whatever equipment she needs. Full access to the armory and ballistic computers. Sir, I must protest, Hayes began. Noted and overruled, Morrison said sharply. Miss Sullivan, you have authorization to attempt this mission. God help us all. As Catherine moved toward the armory, she could feel the weight of every stare in the room. Some looks were skeptical, others curious, a few openly hostile. But she also sensed something else: hope. For the first time in 3 years, someone needed her to be exactly who she'd always been. The walk to the armory felt like stepping back in time. The familiar weight of tactical gear, the precision instruments of long-range shooting, the careful ritual of equipment preparation, all of it awakened parts of herself that had been dormant for too long. She wasn't the coffee lady anymore. She was Staff Sergeant Catherine Sullivan, and people were counting on her to do something impossible. The Barrett M82A1 waiting in the armory was identical to the rifle she'd used in Afghanistan. It's massive, frame designed to reach out across vast distances and deliver devastating precision. Catherine ran her hands along the weapon's familiar contours, checking the action, testing the scope mount, ensuring that every component was properly aligned. Major Walsh appeared at her shoulder, clipboard in hand and skepticism written across her face. The ballistic computer shows a bullet drop of over 300 feet at that range, she said. Even accounting for altitude differential, you're looking at a trajectory that's more artillery than marksmanship. Catherine nodded, loading the ballistic data into her mental calculations. The key is understanding that we're not shooting at a target, we're shooting at a point in space where the target will be when the bullet arrives. At that range, flight time is over 8 seconds. Everything changes in 8 seconds. You're talking about predicting human behavior across impossible distances. No, ma'am, I'm talking about understanding patterns. Enemy fighters in defensive positions follow predictable movement cycles. They expose themselves to observe, they withdraw to communicate, they re-engage to maintain fire superiority. The timing is remarkably consistent if you know what to look for. As Catherine assembled her gear, word of the mission spread through Fort Apache like wildfire. Personnel found excuses to walk past the armory, catching glimpses of the legendary equipment. Being prepared for what everyone understood was either a miracle or a disaster. The base that had forgotten Catherine Sullivan was suddenly very interested in what she could accomplish. The helicopter flight to Eagle Point took 8 minutes through mountain air that grew thinner with each foot of altitude gained. Catherine used the time to study updated satellite imagery, identifying enemy positions and calculating wind patterns from smoke and dust movement visible in the images. Below them, the Colorado mountains stretched endlessly, peaks and valleys that had tested human endurance for centuries. Eagle Point itself was exactly what Catherine needed, a rocky promontory that jutted out from the mountainside like a natural shooting platform. The elevation was 11,847 feet above sea level, giving her a commanding view of the valley where the convoy was trapped. Through her scope, she could see the 3 disabled vehicles, tiny dots of metal against the brown and gray landscape. The distance measurement confirmed her calculations: 21,087 yards. Just over 12 miles of empty air between her position and the ambush site. The longest shot ever attempted by a human being, at a range that pushed every piece of equipment beyond its design specifications. Catherine settled into her shooting position with the deliberate care of someone who understood that everything, her reputation, the lives of the convoy personnel, the future of everyone who'd trusted her with this mission, depended on the next few minutes. She was no longer the coffee lady. She was exactly who she'd always been, a warrior who specialized in impossible shots. The wind was calm, the visibility perfect, and somewhere in the valley below, people were dying while she prepared to attempt something that had never been done before. It was time to remind the world why legends become legendary. Eagle Point perched on the edge of the world like a stone altar to the gods of war. At 11,847 feet above sea level, the air was so thin that each breath felt hollow, but Catherine's body remembered this altitude from years of mountain warfare training. The Barrett M82A1 lay across the rocky outcropping before her, its massive frame steady against the granite that had been carved by millennia of wind and weather. Through her scope, the valley 12 miles below looked like a topographical map come to life. The three vehicles of the diplomatic convoy were barely visible dots clustered in a narrow defile between towering rock walls. Enemy muzzle flashes winked from positions on the surrounding ridgelines like deadly fireflies, each flash representing rounds intended to kill American personnel who were running out of time and options. Catherine's radio crackled with updates from the Tactical Operations Center at Fort Apache. Ghost, this is Control. Convoy reports heavy casualties. Medical personnel are requesting immediate evacuation for critical wounded. Time is running out. Ghost. They were using her old call sign, the name that had once struck fear into enemy hearts, across 3 different theaters of operation. For a moment, Catherine felt the weight of everything that name represented: the missions, the lives saved, the impossible shots that had become legend. Then she forced herself back to the present moment, to the task that would either restore her reputation or destroy what little remained of it. Control, Ghost copies. Beginning target assessment. Now. The scope was a masterpiece of optical engineering, capable of magnifying distant objects to the point where she could read the expressions on enemy faces over 2 miles away. But even with maximum magnification, the Taliban fighters on the ridgelines were tiny figures moving through a landscape that dwarfed human scale. At this distance, she wasn't shooting at people, she was shooting at pixels of light that represented human threats. The ballistic computer mounted beside her rifle displayed calculations that pushed mathematics to its breaking point. Bullet drop at 21,087 yards, 347 feet. Flight time, 8.7 seconds. Wind drift estimation, unknown, requiring real-time adjustment based on environmental observation. The margin for error was measured in fractions of inches across a distance where the curvature of the Earth itself became a factor in trajectory calculations. Catherine had spent years learning to see patterns that others missed, to read environmental conditions like a language written in wind and light. Through her scope, she watched dust plumes rise from enemy positions, studied the movement of smoke from disabled vehicles, analyzed the way heat shimmer distorted the air between her position and the valley floor. Every detail provided information about wind speed, direction, and atmospheric density at different altitudes. The first challenge was identifying the primary target. Intelligence reports suggested that the ambush was being coordinated by a high-value Taliban commander, but distinguishing one armed figure from another at 12 miles was like trying to identify a specific ant in a colony. Catherine needed to watch movement patterns, observe command behavior, look for the subtle signs that separated leaders from followers. Through her scope, she tracked individual fighters as they moved between positions on the ridgelines. Most moved reactively, responding to convoy fire or adjusting their positions based on immediate tactical needs. But one figure moved differently, deliberately, purposefully. checking different firing positions and apparently coordinating the actions of multiple groups. When he appeared on the eastern ridgeline, Catherine could see other fighters orient toward his position, awaiting orders. Control, Ghost has identified a probable command element on the eastern ridge, requesting permission to engage. Ghost, you are cleared hot. Take the shot when ready. Catherine settled deeper into her firing position, her body becoming one with the stone beneath her. This was the moment she'd trained for her entire career, not just the technical challenge of an impossible shot, but the mental discipline required to perform under absolute pressure. 12 miles away, people were dying. 800 miles away, her career hung in the balance. But here, in this moment, there was only the rifle, the target, and the space between them. The first shot was always the most important. Miss, and the enemy would immediately change positions, making subsequent shots nearly impossible. Hit, and she would prove that the impossible was merely improbable when attempted by someone with the right combination of skill, equipment, and determination. Catherine's breathing slowed to match her heartbeat. Through years of training and combat experience, she'd learned to find the space between heartbeats where the human body achieved perfect stillness. In that space, external distractions faded away and only the essential elements remained: sight picture, trigger control, and the absolute certainty that the shot would go exactly where she intended. The crosshairs settled on the command figure. As he paused beside a large boulder, apparently studying the convoy through his own optical equipment, Catherine began her trigger squeeze, not a sudden jerk, but a gradual increase in pressure that would release the firing pin at the precise moment of perfect alignment. The Barrett roared like thunder in the thin mountain air, its massive muzzle brake directing blast pressure away from Catherine's position. The .50 caliber round left the barrel at 2,910 feet per second, beginning its 8-second journey across 12 miles of empty space. Catherine maintained her sight picture, tracking the target through her scope while her spotter Major Walsh, who had insisted on accompanying the mission, called out environmental observations. Wind shift, 2 o'clock, estimated 5 miles per hour, Walsh reported. Target is stationary, still exposed. 8 seconds felt like 8 hours. Catherine watched the Taliban commander through her scope, knowing that the bullet was already in flight, knowing that success or failure had been determined the moment she'd squeezed the trigger. Physics would decide the outcome, not trajectory. Calculations, atmospheric conditions, and the 1,000 variables that separated theoretical possibility from practical reality. The bullet struck the boulder 6 inches to the left of the target. "Miss left," Walsh called out. "Target is moving to cover." Catherine felt no disappointment, no frustration at the near miss. The shot had told her everything she needed to know about environmental conditions at the target area. Wind drift had been slightly higher than calculated. Atmospheric density had affected trajectory in predictable ways, and the bullet drop had been within acceptable parameters. She was zeroed in now, ready for the shot that would matter. Control, Ghost requesting updated target location. Ghost, target has been displaced to a secondary position on the northern ridge. Multiple enemy combatants visible in that location. Catherine adjusted her position, swinging the massive rifle toward the northern ridgeline. Through her scope, she could see the command figure and 3 other fighters positioned behind a natural rock barrier. They felt safe at this distance, confident that no weapon could reach them across 12 miles of mountain air. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The second shot required different calculations. The northern ridgeline was at a slightly different elevation. Wind patterns were affected by the terrain features, and the target was partially concealed behind cover. But Catherine had spent years making shots under adverse conditions, learning to find the gaps in enemy protection that measured mere inches across vast distances. She watched the target through her scope, timing his movements, predicting the moment when he would expose himself enough to present a viable shot. Taliban commanders were predictable in their caution. They would observe, withdraw, then re-emerge to direct their fighters. The timing was consistent if you knew what patterns to look for. When the commander leaned out from behind his cover to observe the convoy, Catherine was ready. Her crosshairs settled on the center of his visible torso, accounting for wind drift, bullet drop, and the 8-second flight time that would carry her round across an impossible distance. The trigger broke like glass dot this time. Catherine didn't watch the target through her scope. Instead, she listened to the radio traffic from the convoy, waiting for confirmation that her shot had found its mark. At this distance, visual confirmation was nearly impossible. The target would simply disappear from view, either behind cover or into the landscape itself. "Control, this is Convoy Leader," came the voice over the radio. "Enemy fire has suddenly decreased. Requesting confirmation on friendly fire support." "Convoy Leader, this is Control. Confirming friendly sniper engagement from extreme range. Can you verify target status?" 3 minutes of tense silence followed. Catherine remained in position, scanning the ridgelines for additional targets while her spotter monitored radio frequencies for any indication of mission success or failure. The Taliban fighters on the eastern and western ridgelines continued their assault, but the coordinated nature of their attack had visibly deteriorated. "Control, this is the Convoy Leader. We have visual confirmation. The enemy command element on the northern ridge appears to have been neutralized. Immediate decrease in enemy coordination and fire discipline. Requesting continued sniper support, if available." Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years: the satisfaction of a mission successfully completed under impossible conditions. The coffee lady had just eliminated a Taliban commander from a distance that would rewrite the record books and tactical manuals. More importantly, she'd bought the convoy precious time to organize their defense and await reinforcement. But the mission wasn't over. With their commander eliminated, the remaining Taliban fighters were operating independently, but they still controlled the high ground and still possessed the firepower to destroy the convoy. Catherine needed to maintain pressure to convince them that continuing the attack would result in death from an enemy they couldn't see or reach. Over the next 45 minutes, Catherine fired 8 more rounds at targets of opportunity. A machine gun team on the western ridge, fighters attempting to move to better positions, enemy personnel trying to set up more advanced weapon systems. Each shot was calculated with the same precision as the first, each impact carefully observed and analyzed for its tactical effect. The psychological impact was devastating. Taliban fighters who had felt secure behind cover 12 miles from any known enemy position were being eliminated by an invisible sniper, whose capabilities defied their understanding of modern warfare. The coordinated assault collapsed into desperate defensive positions as enemy personnel abandoned their attacks to seek better cover. "Control, this is Ghost. Enemy assault has been disrupted. Remaining combatants are withdrawing to defensive positions. Convoy should have window for extraction or reinforcement." Ghost, Control copies. Outstanding work. Air support is now 15 minutes out, ground reinforcement 40 minutes out. Maintain position and continue to provide overwatch. Catherine settled in for the long watch. The immediate crisis had passed, but her job wasn't finished until every member of the convoy was safely evacuated. She'd proven that the impossible shot was possible, but more importantly, she'd reminded everyone watching that some skills transcended politics, bureaucracy, and institutional prejudice. As helicopters appeared on the horizon, racing toward the convoy's position with medical evacuation teams and additional security personnel, Catherine allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The woman they'd called the Coffee Lady had just completed one of the most extraordinary sniper missions in military history. She'd engaged targets at a range that military theorists had considered impossible, achieved hits under conditions that would challenge even computer-guided systems, and saved lives across a distance measured in miles rather than yards. Major Walsh, who had remained silent during most of the engagement, finally spoke into her radio. "Control, this is Spotter 1. Mission accomplished. Ghost has successfully engaged multiple targets at extreme range. Convoy extraction proceeding as planned." "Roger, Spotter 1. Please pass to Ghost Command sends their compliments on an exceptional performance." As Catherine began the careful process of cleaning and securing her rifle, she realized that something fundamental had changed. For the first time in 3 years, she remembered exactly who she was and what she was capable of accomplishing. The institution might have forgotten her value, but the work itself never lied. When lives were on the line and conventional solutions weren't enough, the Army still needed people who could do impossible things. The helicopter flight back to Fort Apache gave Catherine time to process what had just happened. She'd stepped out of invisibility and back into legend, proven that her skills hadn't diminished despite years of institutional neglect. But she also understood that this moment would have consequences, both positive and negative, that would reshape everything. About her future. As Eagle Point fell away below them, Catherine looked out at the mountains that had witnessed her return to form. Somewhere in those peaks, Taliban fighters were reporting to their commanders about an American sniper who could kill at ranges they'd thought were impossible. Somewhere else, convoy personnel were receiving medical treatment they might not have survived to receive without her intervention. And somewhere in the distance, the coffee machine at Fort Apache was probably running empty, waiting for the woman who'd served drinks for 3 years to return and resume her invisible duties. But Catherine Sullivan wasn't the coffee lady anymore. She was a ghost, and the whole world was about to remember what that name had always meant. The secure conference room at Fort Apache had been transformed into something resembling a war crimes tribunal. 3 generals sat behind a polished oak table, their combined decades of military service, creating an atmosphere of institutional gravity that could crush careers with a single word. But this time, the proceeding wasn't about destroying someone. It was about uncovering a truth that had been buried for 3 years. Under layers of bureaucratic deception, General Morrison occupied the center chair, flanked by General Patricia Vance from Army Personnel Command and General Marcus Steele from Special Operations Command. Before them sat a mountain of classified documents, digital files, and testimony transcripts that had taken 48 hours to compile. The investigation had moved with unprecedented speed once Morrison had made a single phone call to the Pentagon, invoking emergency protocols that bypassed normal administrative channels. Catherine sat at a small table facing the tribunal, still wearing the civilian clothes she'd thrown on before the emergency mission. Beside her sat Colonel Sarah Chun, a military defense attorney who'd volunteered her services pro bono after hearing about the case. Chun was known throughout the JAG Corps as someone who specialized in defending soldiers who'd been railroaded by the system, a reputation that made her both valuable and unpopular in equal measure. But the person everyone was waiting to see was Major Thomas Blackwood, now Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood, who sat across the room in what could charitably be called the defendant's chair. His perfectly pressed uniform and confident bearing suggested a man who believed his institutional protections would shield him from consequences. He was about to learn how wrong he was. General Morrison opened the proceeding with words that cut through the formal atmosphere like a blade. This emergency tribunal has been convened to investigate allegations of falsified reports, character assassination, and conspiracy to destroy the career of Staff Sergeant Catherine Sullivan. What we've discovered in the past 48 hours is one of the most systematic campaigns of professional destruction I've encountered in 35 years of military service. The first revelation came from an unexpected source. Captain James Bradley, a communications specialist who'd been present during Operation Desert Wind, had contacted Pentagon investigators within hours of Catherine's successful mission at Eagle Point. Bradley had been carrying guilt for 3 years. watching an innocent soldier's career destroyed while he remained silent to protect his own advancement. Catherine's heroic performance had given him the courage to finally speak truth to power. I was monitoring all radio communications during the Syria operation. Bradley testified via video link from his current assignment in Germany. Staff Sergeant Sullivan's engagement of the enemy sniper team wasn't unauthorized. It was explicitly requested by Major Blackwood himself. I have the complete audio recordings of their tactical communications. The room fell silent as Bradley's words sank in. For 3 years, Blackwood had claimed that Catherine acted without authorization, that her shot had violated explicit orders. But the radio recordings told a different story, one where Blackwood had specifically requested sniper support against enemy positions that threatened his location. General Vance leaned forward, her expression sharp with interest. "Captain Bradley, why didn't you come forward with this information during the original inquiry?" Bradley's voice carried the weight of regret and shame. "Ma'am, I was told by Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood that revealing the communications would compromise ongoing operations and endanger personnel still deployed in the region. He said the official report was necessary to protect classified methods and sources." Colonel Chun stood, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years prosecuting institutional corruption. "General Vance, if I may present Exhibit A7. She activated a digital display that filled the room with the crisp audio of tactical communications recorded 3 years earlier. The voices were distorted by encryption and battlefield conditions, but the words were unmistakable. Blackwood's voice, tense with fear and urgency. "Ghost, I need immediate fire support on that rooftop. 2 enemy snipers have us pinned down. Authorization granted for immediate engagement." Catherine's response was calm and professional. "Understood. Target acquired. Engaging now." The sound of the Barrett rifle firing was followed by Blackwood's obvious relief. "Outstanding shot, Ghost. Threat eliminated. You just saved our asses." The recording continued for another 30 seconds, with Blackwood explicitly thanking Catherine for her quick thinking and exceptional marksmanship. It was the voice of a commanding officer who knew his life had been saved by a subordinate's skill and courage. "General." Morrison's expression was carved from stone as he turned toward Blackwood. "Lieutenant Colonel, would you care to explain the discrepancy between this recording and your sworn testimony during the original inquiry?" Blackwood's confident demeanor cracked for the first time. "Sir, the tactical situation was complex. My recollection of events may have been affected by the stress of combat and the passage of time." "Your recollection?" General Steele's voice carried the incredulity of a man who'd spent decades in special operations. "Colonel, this isn't a matter of memory. You testified under oath that Sergeant Sullivan acted without authorization. The recording proves you explicitly authorized her engagement. But the radio recordings were only the beginning." Over the next hour, the tribunal methodically dismantled every aspect of the case against Catherine. Digital forensics experts had analyzed the psychological evaluation written by Dr. Elizabeth Warner, discovering that key sections had been copied from evaluations of other soldiers and backdated to appear original. The metadata revealed that portions of the document had been created weeks after the supposed evaluation date. Dr. Warner herself appeared via secure video link, her professional composure barely concealing obvious distress. Under oath, she admitted that Blackwood had provided her with guidance about the evaluation's conclusions before she'd even interviewed Catherine. "Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood told me that Sergeant Sullivan had exhibited concerning behavioral patterns during the operation," Warner testified. "He provided specific examples of reckless conduct and emotional instability that he said I should look for during my assessment." Colonel Chun pressed the issue with surgical precision. "Dr. Warner, did Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood influence your professional judgment regarding Sergeant Sullivan's psychological fitness?" I believed I was receiving legitimate command input about a soldier's performance." In retrospect, I realize that my evaluation may have been compromised by preconceived conclusions. The systematic nature of Blackwood's deception became clear as more evidence emerged. Financial records showed that he'd received a significant promotion and assignment to a prestigious Special Operations Command within 6 months of Catherine's demotion. Performance evaluations revealed that his career had accelerated dramatically after the Syria incident, suggesting that his willingness to sacrifice a subordinate had been rewarded by superiors who valued loyalty over truth. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from other soldiers who'd served under Blackwood's command. Once the investigation became public knowledge, personnel began coming forward with stories of intimidation, career threats, and systematic suppression of anyone who might contradict the official narrative. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, who'd been Catherine's assistant instructor at Fort Apache before her demotion, testified about the pressure he'd received to distance himself from her. "Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood called me personally," Torres said. "He told me that my career prospects would suffer if I maintained any association with Sergeant Sullivan. He said the Army needed to move past the embarrassment of having an unstable soldier in a position of responsibility." Similar stories emerged from a dozen other personnel. Blackwood had used his position and connections to create a climate of fear around Catherine's case, ensuring that potential supporters understood the professional cost of defending her. It was a masterpiece of institutional manipulation, using the military's emphasis on loyalty and career advancement to silence anyone who might reveal the truth. General Morrison called for a recess after 4 hours of testimony, but the break only intensified the pressure on Blackwood. News of the investigation had spread throughout the military community with the speed of digital communications. Social media channels used by military personnel buzzed with discussions about the Ghost Files, a reference to the classified documents that were systematically destroying one of the most elaborate cover-ups in recent military history. When the tribunal reconvened, the final piece of evidence proved to be the most devastating. Intelligence analysts had recovered communications intercepts from Syrian and Russian sources, translated documents that painted a completely different picture of Operation Desert Wind. Far from being a rogue operator who endangered the mission, Catherine had been specifically targeted by enemy forces who'd identified her as an exceptional threat. The enemy communications indicate that they'd been tracking Sergeant Sullivan's deployment for weeks, explained Colonel Maria Rodriguez from Army Intelligence. Russian advisors had provided Syrian forces with detailed information about American sniper capabilities, specifically mentioning Sullivan by name. The ambush was designed to eliminate her as much as it was intended to capture our intelligence asset. The implications were staggering. Catherine hadn't just performed heroically during the mission. She'd been the primary target of a sophisticated enemy operation designed to eliminate one of America's most capable snipers. Blackwood's decision to sacrifice her career had accomplished what enemy bullets couldn't: removing a strategic asset from the battlefield. General Vance addressed Blackwood directly, her voice carrying the weight of institutional disappointment. "Lieutenant Colonel, it appears that your actions resulted in the loss of one of our most valuable military assets to enemy psychological warfare. How do you respond to that assessment?" Blackwood's composure finally shattered completely. "I was protecting the integrity of the command structure. Soldiers can't be allowed to act independently, regardless of the outcomes. Discipline and order matter more than individual heroics. So you falsified reports, destroyed a soldier's career, and eliminated a strategic military asset to preserve your concept of discipline." "I did what I believed was necessary to maintain good order and discipline within the unit." General Morrison's response was delivered with the cold precision of a man who'd seen enough institutional corruption to last several lifetimes. "Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood, you're hereby relieved of command pending formal court-martial proceedings. Military police will escort you from this facility immediately." As MPs entered the room to take Blackwood into custody, Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years: vindication. Not just personal satisfaction, but institutional acknowledgement that she'd been wronged by a system that should have protected her. The truth was finally more powerful than the lies that had defined her life for so long. "General." Morrison turned to Catherine with an expression that mixed regret with profound respect. "Sergeant Sullivan, on behalf of the United States Army, I offer you a formal apology for the injustices you've endured. Your service record will be completely restored, your rank returned to Staff Sergeant effective immediately, and you'll receive full back pay for the period of your unjust demotion." But Catherine's response surprised everyone in the room. "Thank you, General, but I need to ask, what about the other soldiers whose careers were damaged because they supported me? What about the people who were transferred or denied promotions because they told the truth?" Morrison nodded slowly, understanding that Catherine's first concern was for others rather than herself. "A complete review is already underway. Every personnel action connected to this case will be examined and corrected where appropriate." The formal restoration took another hour, but the most important moment came when General Morrison presented Catherine with her restored insignia and official documentation clearing her name. 3 years of lies had been swept away by 48 hours of determined investigation, proving that truth, however long delayed, was still more powerful than institutional deception. As the tribunal concluded, Catherine found herself surrounded by officers who'd either ignored her existence or actively contributed to her persecution for 3 years. But their demeanor had changed completely. The woman they'd dismissed as the coffee lady was now someone who'd completed one of the most extraordinary sniper missions in military history while carrying the burden of institutional betrayal. Colonel Chun approached her as the room emptied, her expression mixing professional satisfaction with personal admiration. "Catherine, what you've been through would have broken most people. How did you maintain your integrity through all of this?" Catherine looked around the room where her career had been officially restored, thinking about the 3 years of serving coffee while maintaining her skills in secret. "I learned that dignity isn't something other people give you," she said finally. "It's something you hold on to when everything else is taken away. The work matters more than the recognition." As she walked out of Fort Apache's administrative building, Catherine Sullivan was no longer the coffee lady. She was Staff Sergeant Sullivan again, her record clear and her reputation restored. But more importantly, she was a soldier who'd proven that some values transcended institutional politics: truth, courage, and the willingness to do the right thing regardless of personal cost. The mountains of Colorado stretched endlessly before her, and for the first time in 3 years, the future held possibilities that extended beyond measuring coffee grounds and avoiding eye contact with former colleagues. She was a warrior again, and the world had work for warriors who understood that the hardest battles aren't always fought with rifles. Sometimes they're won with patience, integrity, and the quiet determination to remain who you are when everyone else wants you to disappear. 6 months after her vindication, Staff Sergeant Catherine Sullivan stood before a room filled with the Army's most promising young marksmen. But this wasn't the sterile environment of Fort Apache's traditional classrooms. Instead, she'd chosen the outdoor amphitheater overlooking Eagle Point, where the Colorado mountains served as a backdrop to lessons that couldn't be found in any manual. The longest confirmed kill shot in military history was made from this exact position, she began, her voice carrying easily across the gathered students. 21,087 yards. But that's not what I want to talk about today. The students, a mix of experienced snipers and promising recruits, leaned forward with rapt attention. They knew they were learning from the woman who'd rewritten the record books and exposed one of the military's most shocking cover-ups. But Catherine had something more important to teach them than marksmanship. "I want to talk about integrity under pressure," she continued. About making the right choice when it costs you everything you've worked for. About understanding that your reputation isn't what other people say about you, it's what you do when no one's watching. Among the students sat Marcus Johnson now, 18 and fresh from completing basic training with scores that had caught the attention of special operations recruiters. Beside him sat Elena Rodriguez, 21, and already showing the promise that had convinced Catherine to personally sponsor her application to sniper school. Both had learned their fundamental skills at the youth center where Catherine still volunteered, carrying forward a tradition of excellence that transcended institutional politics. The program Catherine now directed was unlike anything in military history. Officially called the Advanced Individual Performance Initiative, it focused on developing soldiers who could think independently while maintaining absolute loyalty to their mission and their teammates. The Pentagon had given her complete autonomy to design the curriculum, understanding that conventional training methods couldn't produce the kind of exceptional performers the modern military required. "Miss Catherine," Marcus said, using the name he'd called her since he was 16, "how do you teach someone to make impossible shots? I mean, what you did at Eagle Point, how do you train for something like that?" Catherine smiled, remembering the eager teenager who'd asked similar questions 3 years earlier. "Marcus, the impossible shot isn't about the distance or the conditions. It's about maintaining absolute confidence in your abilities while accepting that failure is always possible. The moment you start believing you can't miss is the moment you become dangerous to your own team." The lesson that followed was pure Catherine Sullivan technical excellence wrapped in hard-earned wisdom about character, judgment, and moral courage. She taught them about reading environmental conditions, calculating ballistic trajectories, and maintaining equipment under adverse conditions. But more importantly, she taught them about making ethical decisions under extreme pressure, about protecting teammates who depended on their skills, and about understanding that their primary mission was saving lives rather than taking them. General Morrison, now chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had visited the program the previous month. His assessment had been characteristically direct. "Sergeant Sullivan is producing the kind of soldiers our enemies fear most: technically excellent, morally centered, and absolutely incapable of being corrupted by politics or personal ambition." But Catherine's greatest achievement wasn't producing exceptional marksmen. It was creating a new model for military leadership that emphasized character over career advancement. Her students learned that true strength came from lifting others up rather than climbing over them. That real courage meant defending truth even when it was politically inconvenient, and that the most important battles were often fought far from any battlefield. As the afternoon session concluded, Catherine walked among her students, offering individual guidance and answering questions that revealed their growing understanding of both technical skills and professional responsibilities. These young soldiers would deploy to conflicts around the world, carrying with them not just superior marksmanship abilities, but an unshakable commitment to doing the right thing, regardless of personal cost. Elena approached her as the other students dispersed toward evening chow. "Sergeant Sullivan, I've been accepted for the Special Operations Pipeline. I wanted to thank you for everything you've taught me." Catherine felt the deep satisfaction that came from watching potential transform into reality. "Elena, remember what I told you about impossible shots. The target isn't what matters, it's having the courage to take the shot when lives depend on it." That evening, Catherine returned to her apartment, a larger place now, befitting her restored rank and back pay, where she kept a single photograph on her nightstand. It showed her standing with her first graduating class, 23 soldiers, who'd gone on to distinguish themselves in deployments across the globe. Not one had been killed in action. Not one had compromised their integrity for personal advancement. Each carried forward the lessons learned on the windswept ranges of Colorado. The coffee machine in her kitchen had never been used. After 3 years of measuring grounds and serving others, Catherine had discovered she preferred tea. Some changes went deeper than institutional recognition or professional vindication. Some transformations touched the soul. As she prepared for another day of training soldiers who would carry her legacy into an uncertain future, Catherine Sullivan reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She'd lost everything: rank, reputation, respect, and discovered that losing everything had taught her what truly mattered. Not the recognition or the career advancement, but the simple satisfaction of helping others become the best versions of themselves. The legend of Ghost had been reborn, but it was no longer about impossible shots or record-breaking achievements. It was about proving that integrity, courage, and commitment to excellence could survive any institutional betrayal and emerge stronger than before. It was about showing young soldiers that their character mattered more than their career prospects, that doing the right thing was its own reward, and that true leadership meant creating others who could exceed your own achievements. In the end, they'd called her the Coffee Lady until her shot saved a convoy from 1,200 yards. But Catherine Sullivan had become something much more important than a legendary sniper. She'd become a teacher who understood that the most important targets weren't measured in distance, but in the lives you touched and the values you passed on to those who would follow in your footsteps. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.